Well, welcome to today's Sioux Falls Rental Status Report. It is May 21st, and what we're going to take a look at today is the City Council meeting that happened this week. I'll kind of give you an update on what went down and kind of how it looked. There's also a lot of good updates that came out of that meeting on the One Sioux Falls Fund, the shelters, and kind of getting the sheriff's take on it as well in terms of evictions. And then any questions or answers that we can go through. Well, first of all, the city had a first reading on a resolution. It's not an ordinance, a resolution, asking or telling, depending on which side of the fence you're on, landlords what they wanted to see. Now, this was not an ordinance that they wanted to put in place, even though that's kind of what some of the people supporting it seemed to sound like. So there was a letter that went out from like about 15 different pastors calling for a 90-day eviction moratorium. Now, that's not what this was, but there's definitely some talk of that. So let's look at some of the things they were asking of the city. So now, therefore, be it resolved by the City of Sioux Falls that the city encourages all landlords to show flexibility during the COVID-19 pandemic by first, immediately stopping the assessment and accrual of all late fees and penalties for non-payment of rent for those directly impacted by COVID-19. Now, during the public comment section, a lot of landlords stood up and testified or spoke to this issue, and most of them said, hey, we absolutely are working with residents in terms of not charging late fees or penalties. Only a few were, but that was only if the resident had completely stopped communicating with them and just was unresponsive. So largely, the landlord committee had already done that. Second, demonstrating flexibility with rental due dates for those impacted directly by COVID-19. Again, largely, landlords have already been doing this, working with payment plans, etc. Third, allowing tenants who have been directly impacted by COVID-19 to pay partial amounts. Landlords, again, are doing this, and we're going to see later what the eviction piece looked like. Accepting payments from One Sioux Falls Fund with no further financial obligation to the tenant. So what they were looking for here is the One Sioux Falls Fund would cover up to about 70% of someone's rent, and then the tenant would still be responsible for the last 30%. What the resolution was calling for was the landlords to just waive and write off that last 30%. And I didn't get the feeling, some landlords had done that, others had not. And then this was the big one, stopping the pursuit of evictions exclusively for non-payment of rent for those impacted by COVID-19. This had nothing to do with if somebody's breaking the law, doing drugs, what have you, damaging the property. It was specifically for non-payment of rent and only if they were impacted by COVID-19. And we're going to see that, again, this is already happening. Well, they took a vote on it. The resolution failed 5-3. So that did not get passed. But during the testimony, there's different people that came forward, and there's a lot of good data that was presented. So I just want to give you some of that so you kind of get the lay of the land here in Sioux Falls of what it looks like. So this was from, I believe, Shelley Unruh, who reported this. She said that for every 100 people who make 30% or less of the area median income, only 39 housing units are available. Okay, so this is what we hear about the affordable housing shortage or crisis, what have you. And she believed that an eviction moratorium would drive those units out of the market long term and lead to further shortages of housing. Her point was if you limit landlords' income, you will reduce the housing stock. Right? Landlords are just going to well, what's the point? Why am I renting this house out if I can't collect rent on it? I'd rather have no tenant in place than have a tenant in place, wear and tear, damages, drama, and there's no revenue coming in. And so that would be, if you limit the landlord's income, you're actually going to hurt people, not help. You're going to hurt the people you're trying to help, essentially, is what she was saying. Also, there's some reports on what has happened with the One Sioux Falls Fund. So there's $2.6 million was given as gifts, and then there's another $685,000 has been pledged for a total of $3.3 million in total. The city had put in $750,000. Minnehaha County had put in $250,000, and then for $1 million from the government or from the people at large, essentially. And then the next $2.3 million was all private donors. And in terms of recipients, they had 3,700 applicants so far. 2,600 of those were funded. 838 were denied. The denials, and they didn't say this, but I know the denials, they're looking at people you got to lose your job to actually qualify for this, I believe is one of the other criteria. They had 215 that were outstanding and 100 that were pending. Not sure what the difference between outstanding and pending are, but those are the numbers they delivered. Then they talked about the Minnehaha County. So they looked and said, okay, how many people have received rent type assistance from the county? That's generally the first stop. So if you need help as a tenant, you go to the county. Property taxes that property owners pay to the county, part of that, funds the prison, the county sheriff, the law enforcement, different things like that. But part of it is rent assistance. So it's kind of interesting that, rents get paid to landlords pay property taxes. Those property taxes then turn into rent payments for people who can't afford rent. But during the March through May timeframe of 2019, so last year, they had 750 requests for rental help, 165 requests for deposit help, and 36 requests for people who were living in hotels. There's some people that actually use hotels as their permanent residence. So they had 906 total requests during this time period. During the same time period this year, during COVID, they had 386 requests for rental assistance. You can see that's almost half. 70 deposits, again half, and then hotels was higher for 619. But that's a 50% decrease in requests. Now, probably what's driving this, that doesn't make any logical sense, right? Because you'd think there'd be more need, not less. But what's driving this is I think people are going to the One Sioux Falls Fund rather than to county for this help. And of course, the county has, donated $250,000 to the One Sioux Falls Fund, so it's just a different bucket, I guess. It's the same funds, different bucket. But you can see that the One Sioux Falls Fund definitely has picked up the lion's share of the burden here. Then they reviewed the shelters, and there's a lot more detail than this, but I boiled this down to say there's about 214 beds available for the shelters, and they've used about 179 beds on average are used. So the shelters are not completely full, which is a good thing. Then they looked and talked to the sheriff, and he was saying that if you look at the same time period, March through May of last year in 2019, they had 52 court-ordered lockouts. The judge, files against the tenant, orders the sheriff to lock him out, and the sheriff executes that lockout. This year, same time period, had the exact same number of lockouts. So the sheriff's point is he does not see a raft of additional evictions happening in Sioux Falls. Now, to be fair, the sheriff is not the first one that's going to see it, right? So if you think about it, it takes a couple months to get an eviction through the court, and so he's not going to necessarily see it right away. Now, if there's lots of evictions starting in March, you should start seeing some of those start to get locked out in May, but you're just not seeing that right now. Now, that could happen in the future. So the sheriff lockouts is actually a lagging measure, but the court lawsuits, essentially the eviction lawsuits, are the leading indicator. And I don't know exactly who it was that was saying this. I'm going to find out. But was saying the justice that oversees the other judges in the circuit courts, he actually reached out to his circuit courts and said, listen, I want to know if you see an uptick in evictions or foreclosures. And he said that no, the circuit courts are not seeing an uptick. And so that would indicate that lockouts and lawsuits are no greater this year than they were last year. And then the last point here, the sheriff really didn't think the city even had the authority to limit evictions. The county has that jurisdiction. Now, that's not what the resolution was for, but that's definitely what some of the supporters of the resolution were calling for, was a 90-day moratorium on evictions. So that's what I have for you today. If you got questions or comments, you can join us at bit.ly /RPM Sioux Falls, or leave comments or questions in the chat boxes. Thanks.